It wasn't supposed to be seen. Not by her. Not by anyone outside a tightly controlled inner circle. But in a moment that lasted less than a minute, everything changed. One document. One timeline. And suddenly, Zara wasn't just a bystander to royal tradition, she was staring directly into the future of the monarchy. A future that had already been decided, without the world knowing it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, it didn't make sense. The structure of the document felt too precise, too deliberate to be casual, yet too concealed to be ceremonial. It wasn't written like something meant for history, it was written like something meant to stay hidden. Names weren't fully spelled out. Certain details were fragmented, almost as if they were meant to be understood only by those already initiated into its meaning. And yet, despite the coded nature of it all, one thing stood out with chilling clarity. The references to Charles were not symbolic. They were specific, measured, calculated in a way that suggested this wasn't anticipation, it was expectation. Zara's first instinct was to dismiss it, to convince herself that what she was seeing had to be misinterpreted, taken out of context, perhaps even incomplete. But the deeper she read, the harder it became to hold on to that denial. Dates began to align in ways that felt too exact to ignore. Mentions of private evaluations, carefully spaced intervals, and controlled appearances formed a pattern, one that pointed not to uncertainty, but to inevitability. This wasn't a document asking what might happen. It was outlining what would. And that realization settled heavily. Because if this timeline was real, if these dates were more than projections, then it meant decisions had already been made. Quietly, strategically, without the world ever being told. The monarchy, an institution built on the illusion of continuity and control, suddenly felt like something else entirely. Something operating behind a curtain, where outcomes were decided long before they were revealed. Her breath slowed, but her thoughts didn't. They raced, circling back to one unavoidable question. How long had this been in motion? There were hints buried between the lines, subtle indications that this wasn't recent. Certain entries referenced moments that had already passed, events that at the time seemed routine now recontextualized as part of something far more deliberate. A quiet arrangement unfolding over time, unnoticed by those who weren't looking closely enough. And Zara hadn't been looking. Until now. But what unsettled her most wasn't just the content of the document, it was what it demanded from her. Because knowing something like this wasn't passive. It wasn't something you could simply unread or forget. It forced a choice. To walk away and pretend it meant nothing. Or to accept that she had just stepped into something far bigger than herself. Something controlled, structured, and already moving forward with or without her understanding. The weight of that choice pressed in, sharper with every passing second. Ignore it, and she remained safe, untouched by whatever this truly was. Confront it, and she risked unraveling something that clearly wasn't meant to be questioned. And yet, even as that fear lingered, so did something else. A growing sense that this wasn't just about information, it was about timing. About being in the wrong place at the exact right moment, to see what others had been carefully keeping out of sight. Because this wasn't just a document, it was a signal. A glimpse into a version of events that hadn't yet been made public, but were already unfolding behind closed doors. And now that she had seen it, there was no going back to not knowing. No returning to the comfortable distance of being outside it all. Zara had crossed a line without even realizing it, and whatever came next would not wait for her to be ready. But what Zara didn't realize yet was that this timeline wasn't just about Charles, it was about control, and who was already preparing to take it. The dates didn't just suggest a possibility, they mapped out a future already in motion. Medical evaluations, scheduled absences, carefully timed public appearances, it was all there. A roadmap to a royal transition that no one had announced. And as Zara read deeper, one thing became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't a contingency plan. This was a countdown. What had first felt like fragments now began to align with unsettling precision. Each entry carried weight, not because of what it said individually, but because of how perfectly it connected to the next. There were milestones clearly defined, quietly recorded that traced a path forward with almost clinical certainty. Early notations hinted at subtle concerns, moments that, at the time, might have been dismissed as routine. But here, within this timeline, they were redefined as starting points, the beginning of something that had been carefully monitored, measured, and, most disturbingly, expected to evolve in a very specific way. Zara's focus tightened as she followed the progression. The language shifted as the dates advanced. What began as observation turned into coordination. Mentions of consultations private, unannounced, and deliberately obscured appeared with increasing frequency. There were references to treatments, but never in direct terms, always framed in controlled phrasing that revealed just enough to be understood by those meant to understand it. Recovery projections weren't hopeful, they were calculated, built into the structure of the timeline as if outcomes had already been quietly agreed upon. And then there were the gaps, strategic silences where information should have been, replaced instead with carefully timed public appearances. Events that, on the surface, had seemed ordinary ceremonial duties, brief engagements, controlled visibility. But now, within the context of the timeline, they felt different, positioned, almost as if they were designed not to reflect reality, but to distract from it. A carefully curated narrative running parallel to something far more serious unfolding behind closed doors. That was when the unease deepened into something sharper. Because this level of coordination didn't happen in isolation. It required awareness, agreement, participation. And as Zara traced the subtle markers embedded within the document initials, approvals, moments of synchronization, it became clear that others had been part of this for far longer than she had. Figures within the institution who weren't reacting to events as they happened, but moving in alignment with something that had already been decided. The realization pressed in slowly, but once it took hold, it refused to loosen. This wasn't about uncertainty. It wasn't about preparing for every possibility. This was about controlling a singular outcome. Every adjustment, every carefully placed event, every silence, it all pointed to a system operating with intention, not hesitation. And the more Zara understood that, the harder it became to ignore what it implied. Because if this timeline had been constructed with such precision, then the story being presented to the world wasn't just incomplete, it was curated. Managed in a way that kept attention focused exactly where it needed to be, while everything else remained hidden just beneath the surface. The public saw continuity, stability. But behind that, there was something else entirely. A structure designed to guide perception while something far more significant quietly advanced. Her grip tightened, not on the document itself, but on the reality it represented. Every line she had read stripped away another layer of assumption, replacing it with something colder, more deliberate. This wasn't unfolding naturally. It was being directed. And the thought of how long this had been happening, how seamlessly it had been concealed, sent a quiet, unshakable tension through her. Because this level of control didn't just appear overnight. It was built, maintained, protected. And now, for reasons she couldn't yet fully understand, she had been allowed, whether by accident or design, to see it, to understand it, to stand at the edge of something that was already moving forward, regardless of who was watching. And if the timeline was this precise, then someone had been planning the next move long before anyone dared to speak it aloud. Zara wasn't the first to know. In fact, she was never meant to know at all. Because buried within the timeline were subtle indicators, names, initials, coded approvals that pointed to a small, powerful circle already orchestrating the monarchy's next chapter. And the deeper she looked, the more unsettling the truth became. This wasn't just preparation, it was coordination. At first, the markings seemed insignificant. A set of initials beside a date. A brief notation that looked administrative rather than intentional. But the more Zara traced them, the more a pattern began to emerge, one that felt far too deliberate to ignore. These weren't random annotations. They were confirmations. Silent acknowledgments between individuals who clearly understood far more than what had ever been made public. And once that realization settled in, the document changed again. It was no longer just a timeline, it was a record of involvement. Certain names appeared more than once, always at critical moments. Not in full, never directly exposed, but present enough to leave a trail. Figures positioned close to the center of power. Individuals whose roles on the surface seemed routine, but here, within the structure of this hidden framework, they carried weight. Zara could feel it now, the invisible threads connecting each entry, pulling everything into alignment. This wasn't a loose collection of decisions. It was organized, directed. And it didn't stop at names. There were references to meetings never described in detail, but placed with precision. Dates that matched gaps in public schedules. Moments where visibility dropped just enough to allow something else to happen behind closed doors. Conversations that never reached the surface, yet clearly shaped what followed. The more Zara followed those gaps, the more she understood what they represented. Strategy sessions. Quiet agreements. Decisions made without scrutiny, but with lasting impact. That realization carried a weight she hadn't expected. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about what had been planned, it was about who had been trusted to plan it. And she wasn't among them. That truth cut deeper than she anticipated. Not because she expected to be included, but because of what her exclusion implied. There was a line, clearly drawn, separating those who knew from those who didn't. And without meaning to, she had stepped across it. But with that awareness came something else. A subtle, uncomfortable sense that simply knowing might already be too much. That this wasn't information meant to be shared freely, even within the institution itself. The silence surrounding it wasn't passive, it was deliberate, maintained with care, protected in a way that suggested consequences for anyone who disturbed it. And now, standing on the outside of that carefully constructed circle, Zara could feel the tension of it pressing in. Yet what unsettled her most wasn't just the coordination, it was the cracks within it. Because not every mark carried the same certainty. Some notations felt sharper, more decisive, while others seemed hesitant, almost reluctant. As if not everyone involved had agreed with the pace, or even the direction. Subtle inconsistencies, easy to overlook at first, but impossible to ignore once noticed. They hinted at something beneath the surface, differences in opinion, perhaps even quiet resistance. And that changed everything. Because if there were fractures within this circle, then the control it projected wasn't as absolute as it appeared. It was being maintained. Yes, but not without tension. Not without disagreement. And that meant the timeline itself wasn't just a plan, it was a compromise. A negotiated path forward shaped by forces that didn't fully align. Zara felt it then, the shift from observation to involvement. Because understanding this didn't leave her untouched. It placed her in a position she had never asked for, but could no longer avoid. She wasn't just looking at a system in motion, she was standing close enough to feel its instability, close enough to see where it might bend, or even break. And that was the most dangerous realization of all. Because systems built on silence don't just protect themselves, they react when that silence is threatened. And whether she intended it or not, Zara had already become part of that equation, a variable no one had accounted for. Or perhaps, one they had. But even within that circle of power, there were fractures forming, and Zara was about to step directly into them. He wasn't just next in line, he was already being prepared. Quietly. Relentlessly. Without pause. As Zara connected the dots, one name kept resurfacing in the timeline. William. Not as a future king, but as someone already being positioned for the role. Far sooner than anyone expected. And the weight of that realization was almost unbearable. At first it appeared subtle, a shift in presence, a gradual increase in responsibility, that, on the surface, could easily be explained as natural progression. But within the framework of the timeline, those moments no longer felt organic. They were aligned too perfectly with the dates, too synchronized with the underlying structure Zara had just uncovered. Appearances that once seemed routine now carried a different meaning. They weren't just duties, they were signals. Carefully placed, quietly executed. Designed to prepare both him and the world for something approaching faster than anyone realized. Zara felt it in the way the timeline treated his involvement not as an eventual step, but as an active phase already in motion. Certain entries referenced transitions of responsibility that had no public acknowledgement. Others hinted at private briefings. Moments where William was drawn closer to decisions that traditionally would have remained out of reach. It wasn't gradual, it was deliberate. A steady pull forward, measured but unmistakable, as if time itself had been quietly shortened for him. And then came the emotional weight of it, the part that wasn't written, but could still be felt between the lines. Because preparation at this level didn't come without cost. There were indications, subtle yet persistent, that something within him had already begun to shift. A restraint that hadn't been there before. A controlled presence that felt less like confidence and more like containment. The timeline didn't describe emotions, but it didn't need to. The pattern revealed enough. This wasn't just about readiness, it was about endurance. The deeper Zara followed that thread, the more uncomfortable the truth became. Because every adjustment, every added responsibility, carried an unspoken implication. He wasn't being asked if he was ready. He was being shaped to be ready. And there was a difference. One allowed for choice, the other didn't. That realization lingered, heavy and unresolved, forcing her to reconsider everything she thought she understood about succession, about duty, about what it meant to stand in that position. What unsettled her even more was the pace. The later entries in the timeline revealed a shift subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The intervals between key moments began to tighten. Decisions that would normally unfold over extended periods were now compressed, brought closer together in a way that suggested urgency. Something was changing. Something that wasn't being openly addressed, yet was clearly influencing how quickly everything was moving forward. And within that acceleration, William's role became even more pronounced. Not just present, but central. Positioned in ways that left little room for delay, as if the system itself was adjusting around him, pushing him into place faster than originally intended. Zara could feel the pressure embedded within those entries, even without explicit words. It wasn't just expectation, it was demand. A silent insistence that he step into something he might not have fully chosen, but could no longer avoid. That was the moment the question surfaced, quiet, but impossible to dismiss. Had he ever truly had a choice? Or had this path been set long before he had the chance to question it? The timeline didn't answer that directly, but it didn't need to. The structure, the pacing, the careful alignment of events, all of it pointed toward a reality where personal readiness mattered less than institutional necessity. Where the weight of tradition didn't just guide, it compelled. Zara felt the tension of it settle in, deeper than before. Because this wasn't just about a system in motion, it was about the people within it, carrying burdens that were never fully seen, never openly acknowledged. And as she stood there, holding the evidence of how precisely everything had been arranged, one truth became impossible to ignore. If William was already being moved into position, then this wasn't a distant future. It was already happening. Quietly. Irreversibly. And far sooner than anyone outside that inner circle had been allowed to understand. And if William was being pushed forward, then someone else might be pulling the strings from behind. She didn't appear often in the timeline, but when she did, it was impossible to ignore. Strategic placements. Carefully timed appearances. Decisions that seemed small until they weren't. As Zara traced these moments, a new realization surfaced. Camilla wasn't just part of the transition, she was influencing it in ways no one openly discussed. At first, her presence felt almost incidental. A name appearing briefly beside a date, a quiet involvement tied to moments that didn't seem central at a glance. But Zara had already learned not to trust first impressions. Within a document this precise, nothing was accidental. Every entry served a purpose. Every placement carried intent. And once she began isolating those moments, pulling them out from the larger structure, they formed a pattern that was far more deliberate than it initially appeared. Camilla's role wasn't constant, but it was decisive. She appeared at turning points, at moments where direction shifted, where timing adjusted, where the pace either slowed just enough to maintain control or accelerated in a way that suggested urgency. It wasn't overt authority, it was something quieter, more controlled. Influence that didn't need to be announced to be effective. And that was what made it so difficult to ignore. Zara felt a subtle tension rise as she followed that thread. Because influence like this didn't exist in isolation. It required trust, access, a level of proximity that allowed certain decisions to be shaped without ever being formally declared. And yet, within the timeline, that influence was never fully explained. It was implied. Embedded within the structure in a way that suggested it had been there from the beginning, quietly guiding the flow of events while remaining just out of reach. The deeper she looked, the more that quiet presence began to expand. It wasn't just about individual moments anymore, it was about continuity. Indications that this positioning hadn't started recently, but had been building over time. Small, calculated steps that, taken individually, might have gone unnoticed. But together, they revealed something far more significant. A steady alignment with the unfolding transition, as if certain outcomes had been anticipated and prepared for long before they became necessary. That realization unsettled her in a way she hadn't expected, because it introduced a new layer of uncertainty. Trust had always been an assumed constant within the structure of the monarchy, something that held everything together even when pressures mounted. But now, that certainty felt less stable, not broken but shifting, because influence, especially when it remained unspoken, raised questions. Questions about intention, about priority, about who truly benefited from the way this timeline had been constructed. And those questions didn't come with easy answers. The document didn't explain motives. It didn't clarify boundaries. It simply presented a sequence of events, shaped in ways that suggested someone had been carefully guiding them. Zara could feel that guidance now, not as something visible, but as something undeniable. A presence woven into the timeline itself, adjusting its course without ever fully revealing its hand. What made it even more difficult to process was how seamlessly it all fit together. Nothing felt forced. Nothing appeared out of place. Every adjustment aligned perfectly with what came before it, as if the entire structure had been designed to accommodate this influence without ever exposing it. And that level of integration didn't happen by chance. It required foresight, planning, a deep understanding of how the system operated and how it could be shaped without drawing attention. Zara's thoughts lingered there, caught between recognition and uncertainty. Because if this influence had been present from the start, then it wasn't just reacting to the timeline, it was helping define it. Quietly steering its direction, ensuring that certain outcomes remained within reach, while others were carefully avoided. And that raised a question she couldn't ignore. How much control did Camilla truly hold? Not just within these moments, but within the larger structure itself. Because influence, once established, rarely stays limited. It expands. It adapts. And in a system already built on precision and control, even the smallest shift in influence could reshape everything that followed. Zara could feel that possibility now. Subtle but undeniable. As if the timeline itself carried layers she had only just begun to understand. But the deeper Zara went, the more she realized this wasn't just about influence, it was about timing something far more urgent. Something changed. The timeline didn't just move, it accelerated. Dates shifted. Events tightened. And suddenly what once felt distant became dangerously close. Zara could feel it now. The quiet preparation was turning into imminent reality. And whatever was driving this sudden urgency, it wasn't being explained. At first, it was almost imperceptible. A slight compression between entries, a narrowing of space where time once stretched more comfortably. But the more she followed the sequence, the clearer it became this wasn't natural progression. The rhythm had changed. What had once unfolded with calculated patience was now moving with a kind of controlled urgency that felt impossible to ignore. The gaps between key moments began to close, pulling events closer together as if something unseen was pressing forward, demanding resolution. Zara's pulse quickened as she traced the later stages. Critical decisions, once spaced apart with careful intention, were now clustered together in a way that felt deliberate but strained. Consultations overlapped. Appearances aligned too closely. Transitions that should have taken time were suddenly condensed into tighter windows, leaving little room for adjustment. It wasn't just faster, it was compressed. And that compression carried a tension that seemed to build with every passing entry. There were subtle indications buried within the structure, hints that something underlying the timeline had shifted. References to reassessments appeared more frequently. Not detailed, not explained, but present enough to suggest that whatever had originally been projected was no longer holding steady. The careful balance that had once defined the plan now felt disrupted, as though the reality it was built upon had begun to change in ways that couldn't be ignored. And at the center of that shift, unspoken but unmistakable, was Charles. Zara didn't need direct confirmation to understand what that implied. The acceleration wasn't arbitrary, it was reactive. Something had evolved faster than expected, forcing the entire structure to adjust in response. And that realization carried a weight that settled deep within her. Because if the timeline was being pushed forward, then everything tied to it, every preparation, every positioning, every quiet decision was being pulled along with it. Faster. Tighter. Less forgiving. The emotional shift was immediate. The uncertainty that had once lingered was gone, replaced by something far more urgent. There was no longer the illusion of distance, no sense that this was unfolding somewhere far ahead. It was happening now, already in motion, already closing in on the points Zara had just begun to understand. And with that realization came something she hadn't anticipated, a growing pressure that felt impossible to ignore. Because knowing this wasn't passive anymore. It wasn't something she could set aside and revisit later. The pace of the timeline made that clear. Every moment she hesitated, every second she allowed to pass without action, felt like time slipping further out of reach. The window she had unknowingly stepped into was narrowing, closing in ways that left little room for indecision. And the more she felt that pressure, the more the weight of her position became impossible to deny. What unsettled her most was how controlled the acceleration still felt. Even as everything moved faster, there was no chaos, no visible cracks, just a tightening of structure, as if the system had anticipated this possibility and was now adjusting with quiet precision. That level of control, even under pressure, suggested something far deeper than simple planning. It suggested readiness. Preparation for a shift that, while sudden to her, may have already been considered within those inner circles long before this moment. And that thought lingered, sharper than the rest. Because if this acceleration had been anticipated, if this urgency was not entirely unexpected, then the timeline itself wasn't just reacting. It was adapting. Moving forward with a purpose that extended beyond what was written, beyond what Zara had uncovered so far. And that meant there were still layers she hadn't seen. Still decisions unfolding just out of view. The realization hit quietly, but it changed everything. Because this was no longer about understanding what had been planned, it was about recognizing what was already happening. And once that line was crossed, there was no space left for distance. No comfort in observation. Only movement. Only consequence. And as the timeline rushed forward, Zara knew she could no longer remain just an observer. There comes a moment when knowing too much becomes impossible to carry. For Zara, that moment had arrived. The timeline wasn't just information, it was a burden. A responsibility. A choice. Stay silent and protect the system. Or risk everything by bringing the truth into the open. And either way, there would be consequences. It settled in slowly at first. Not as panic, but as weight. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but lingers pressing, persistent, impossible to ignore. Every detail she had uncovered now felt heavier than before. Not because it had changed, but because she had. She wasn't just observing the timeline anymore. She was part of it. And that shift, subtle yet irreversible, made everything more complicated than she had anticipated. Her thoughts circled endlessly, searching for a way to contain what she knew. To place it back into a safe distance where it couldn't affect her, where it remained just information instead of implication. But there was no distance left. Every line she had read, every pattern she had traced, had drawn her closer to something that demanded a response. And the more she tried to hold on to silence, the more it began to feel like complicity. Because silence wasn't neutral. Not here. Not with something this controlled, this deliberate, already in motion. To say nothing was to allow it to continue exactly as planned. To accept the structure as it was, even if she didn't fully understand it. And that realization cut deeper than she expected. Because it forced her to confront a truth she hadn't wanted to face. This wasn't just about what was happening. It was about what she was willing to accept. Loyalty had always been clear before. Defined by tradition, shaped by expectation, reinforced through everything she had grown up around. But now, that clarity felt fractured, because loyalty to the institution no longer felt separate from the consequences of its actions. And as she stood there, caught between what she had been taught and what she now understood, the line between duty and denial began to blur. There was fear in that space. Not loud, not overwhelming, but steady. The kind that comes from knowing that any decision, once made, cannot be undone. If she spoke, she risked disrupting something that had been carefully constructed over time. A system that thrived on control, on precision, on silence. And systems like that didn't respond lightly to disruption. They protected themselves. Quietly, but effectively. But staying silent carried its own cost. A different kind of consequence. Less visible but just as real. Because it meant carrying the weight of what she knew alone. Watching as events unfolded exactly as outlined. Knowing she had seen it coming and chosen not to act. That kind of burden didn't fade, it deepened. It settled into every moment, reshaping how everything was understood moving forward. Zara could feel the tension between those choices tightening, leaving no room for comfort, no space for delay. This wasn't a decision she could postpone. The timeline itself made that clear. It was moving forward with or without her, closing in on moments that would soon become impossible to ignore. And the closer it came, the more her silence or her voice would matter. Her breath slowed, but her thoughts sharpened. Because beneath the conflict, beneath the uncertainty, one truth remained undeniable. This wasn't just about her anymore. Whatever she chose would ripple outward, touching lives, altering paths, shifting outcomes in ways she couldn't fully predict. And that realization, more than anything else, made the decision feel impossible and unavoidable at the same time. Because knowing something like this changed everything. It demanded something in return. Action, acceptance, or defiance, but never indifference. And as that truth settled in, Zara understood that there was no safe path forward, only necessary ones. But what Zara didn't yet know was that the timeline had already accounted for her choice. It was never just a timeline. It was a strategy. Hidden beneath the dates and details was something far more calculated, a plan designed to adapt, control, and even anticipate disruption, including hers. And as Zara uncovered the final layer, the truth became undeniable. This transition had been engineered down to the smallest reaction, even the ones no one was supposed to see coming. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. The structure appeared familiar: dates, annotations, progressions, but something about the final entries felt different. More complex. Less linear. It wasn't just outlining what would happen, it was branching. Splitting into possibilities, each one mapped with the same precision she had already come to recognize. And as she followed those paths, her breath caught. Because these weren't alternatives in the traditional sense. They were responses. Predetermined outcomes designed to activate depending on how events unfolded. Zara felt a chill settle in as the implications took hold. This wasn't just preparation, it was anticipation. The timeline didn't just account for controlled scenarios, it extended into uncertainty, into moments that couldn't be fully predicted, yet had been carefully considered anyway. There were indicators tied not just to events, but to reactions. Public shifts. Internal responses. Even potential disruptions. Each one mapped with unsettling clarity, as if the system itself had already rehearsed every possible outcome before it had the chance to occur. And then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, she saw it. A reference so subtle it could have been overlooked, yet so precise it felt impossible to ignore. A scenario tied to discovery, to exposure, to someone seeing what wasn't meant to be seen. The language was distant, coded, detached, but the meaning was unmistakable. The timeline hadn't just prepared for events, it had prepared for awareness, for interference, for someone like her. The realization struck with a force she couldn't contain. This wasn't coincidence. It wasn't an oversight. It meant that her presence here, in this moment, might not be entirely unexpected. That even her reaction, her hesitation, her conflict, her potential decision to act, had been considered within the framework she was now standing inside. And that thought reshaped everything. Because it blurred the line between discovery and design, in a way that felt deeply unsettling. The monarchy, as she had always understood it, was built on structure, on continuity, on a kind of controlled evolution that balanced tradition with change. But this was something else. This was control taken further than she had imagined. Not just guiding events, but shaping the narrative around them. Anticipating how people would respond, how stories would unfold, how perception itself could be managed before it even formed. Zara's grip tightened as the final pieces fell into place. Because once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. Every layer of the timeline now revealed something deeper, something more intentional. The precision, the coordination, the acceleration, the influence. It all connected, not as separate elements but as parts of a single, cohesive design. And within that design, there was no randomness, no uncertainty left unaddressed. That was the moment the truth settled fully, undeniable and absolute. Nothing about this had been left to chance. Not the timing, not the decisions, not even the potential for disruption. It had all been accounted for, woven into a system that didn't just react to the future, it shaped it before it arrived. And standing there, at the edge of that realization, Zara understood something that changed everything she thought she knew. Because this wasn't just a transition of power, it was a controlled transformation, engineered with such precision that even those within it might never fully see its boundaries. And now that she had glimpsed those boundaries, now that she understood how far they extended, there was no returning to the simplicity of before. Only the weight of knowing what this truly was. And with that final truth in her hands, Zara understood that the monarchy wasn't just preparing for the future, it had already decided how it would unfold. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.